The first thing people ask when they find out that a friend is a prepper is typically, "So what are you prepping for?" And while it would be tempting to simply gesture around oneself at the world today, the general state of reality belies some of the more active and obvious threats. While saber rattling from Russia, China, and Iran may seem scary because they are nuclear armed, it is unlikely anyone would push that big red button because they know that we also have a big red button and we have a better track record of maintenance, so ours will have a better chance of working. There are a lot of end of the world scenarios that don't require anyone to push the spicy kaboom button, and therefore are much more likely to happen. One that is forefront in my mind already, has many components in place, and the enemy has shown a capacity and willingness to act. Infrastructure across the world is almost without exception digitalized and connected to the internet in some way. Whereas in the past it would require a saboteur to get into a country, secure tools and weapons, and then make a strike on, say, a water treatment plant or a power plant before they could affect anything. Now you just need to infiltrate the system that operate many of the facilities across entire regions. If you are restricted to only physical assets in place, it limits the scope of damage that can be done by any single infiltrator or country. The larger the infiltration, the higher the risk of detection. While this somewhat contradicts my previous video on infiltration, you must keep in mind that major industrial facilities and infrastructure, such as power plants, have not insubstantial security, and unless there was a major concerted effort, it would be hard to attack one without tipping your hand and putting the entire country on high alert. This is why last week's video was about mass simultaneous movement. Because when it comes to, say, spy, sabotage, and skullduggery, secrecy is your greatest weapon. Once the enemy knows you are up to something, they can start a response. This means that if it weren't for the internet, it would be hard to knock out the power to entire regions or entire countries. Now today, we know for a fact that Chinese actors have infiltrated systems operating power plants, internet servers, treatment plants, and even military assets across the country. Every month or two, there's a new article about how Chinese digital infiltration or malware was discovered in those systems. It makes you wonder if they have infiltrated our systems to the point where they could simply shut off our power and flood our water supplies with septic runoff if a war started. It wouldn't even require total system failure to create a catastrophic scenario. All they would need to do is degrade our systems enough to cause cascade failures, and our own demands on the system would finish the job for them. The point is, our daily lives rely on systems that can and would be taken down in the event of a major war. The apocalypse that everyone used to mock preppers for would likely not happen because of a nuclear strike, but would absolutely happen in the event of a cyber attack. There wouldn't be radiation in the street, it would be our own backed up sewage in the street. There wouldn't be buildings toppled by atomic blasts, but the quiet streets of a powerless city slowly stewing in desperation. At first, nobody would really understand what was happening. If this cyber attack happened before or simultaneous with the start of a war, most people wouldn't even know what was happening. They would simply think it was a normal power outage. Depending on where you live and the season, it could seem perfectly normal at first. The power goes down, no biggie, just wait for it to come back up. A horrible stench begins to fill the town as sewage backs up. A day or two go by with no power and no water. People have already cleared out the stores looking for normal outage supplies, but now the panic buying kicks into high gear as people fight over the last water filters and juice boxes. Many people focus on EMP when discussing a grid down situation, but this would be substantially different. While a cyber attack would likely take out the internet connectivity in many areas, it would have no effect on most computers unless the cyber attack is extremely sophisticated. You would still have your car, radios, and other equipment. So unlike during an EMP, where you would be grounded and couldn't leave easily unless you were already prepared, you could hop into your car and seek shelter in the countryside. However, many people will try this with no friends or families in the countryside who is ready and able to take them in, creating a massive refugee problem. The problem with disaster refugees is that when they aren't given the shelter, food, and other help that they want, they tend to get aggressive and often violent. This is true universally, and being from a first world country will only shorten the patience people have with being uncomfortable, hungry, and fearful. People have less tolerance for new uncomfortable feelings. Backing up a little bit, you are still in your home. You realize you only have a few days of food left and no way to cook what you do have on your electric stove. You may have a camping set and break that out, or a propane grill, but that only goes so far to cook packaged macaroni and cheese with your dwindling water supply. Shortly, all of your meat is bad and everything in your freezer. Maybe you poured all that sour milk and rotting orange juice down the drain, only to remember that the water isn't working anymore and your house starts to stink. Waste starts to pile up in the toilets. Without access to dependable water, someone drinks something they shouldn't have and ends up with the runs. This quickly overwhelms what little sanitation you have left, and before you decide to switch to a hole in the backyard, your whole house starts to smell like literal shit and rotting milk. By now you have probably been talking to your neighbors, and hopefully one or two have some radios, maybe a CB or ham radio, but at least some talkies or a police scanner. From that you discover that the problem isn't isolated. Everywhere you could think to go, they are suffering from the same problems. Nobody knows if it's going to get better quickly. The population splits into two camps. One group that wants to shelter in place and wait for the government to fix the water, sewer, and power. And one that realizes that it isn't going to happen soon and your situation is getting desperate, with people running out of food and everyone is already out of water. You also hear gunshots, and over your police scanner you hear nothing but constant chaos and alerts. It seems that the local police and fire are completely overwhelmed, and there is no chatter about when the utilities are going to be fixed. At this point, many people would come to the conclusion that it is time to get out of the city. But that means you and millions of other people have just decided to flood and overwhelm the surrounding semi-rural and rural areas. The people living there, dealing with their own problems, aren't going to be happy to see you flooding through, let alone showing up at their doors, asking for their limited supplies, or even for them to take you in. Unlike an EMP, where most people would be reduced to walking, this would result in huge traffic jams as people try to leave the city. The end result, people would quickly run out of gas, and gridlock would happen on most ways out of the city. This is why most people who have bug out locations would get out of town on the first suspicion that this was more than a little power outage. Once out of town, the people who could go further to look for shelter would have an advantage, as the regions within a drive possible on a single tank of gas would get flooded by people looking for shelter and food. Many people would get fed up with being turned away, and it could get violent as people stop asking and start trying to take what they want. Once this happens, we could see complete societal breakdown. The emergency services and law enforcement of rural areas would be completely incapable of handling this many people. Even if they called up the National Guard and found a way to alert and rally their people under these circumstances, they would be massively outnumbered, as there are 450,000 National Guard and 700,000 law enforcement officers to 331 million Americans. This means even if every administrative person, mechanic, and desk jockey in the entire law enforcement and National Guard apparatus of our country were put on the lines trying to control the chaos, they would still be outnumbered by 287 to 1. As soon as people start trying to force their way into shelters or homes and start looting the resources they need to keep themselves and their children fed and alive, complete chaos would reign. In my opinion, this would be more ugly than a nuclear weapon, because the damage would be done by Americans against Americans. They would be worse and more ongoing suffering than a nuke, whose lethal radiation dissipates within 48 hours. You would see towns becoming city-states, denying entry to those they see as roving bands of raiders and leeches. People would hunker down and protect their homes and property with lethal force. Only those who got out early and fast would be able to secure their own survival ahead of the curve. While this is all happening, just like with nuclear weapons, it wouldn't save Russia, China, or Iran. All this would do is cause us to treat the Geneva Convention like a checklist. I have every confidence that we have our own cyber warfare divisions that would send similar attacks at the attacking country. If that didn't work, we may escalate to EMP, as their attack was essentially the same thing. Most of these attacks wouldn't affect military equipment, let alone warships that are deployed in the field. Even if the enemy was China, they would still be hit with overwhelming firepower. The most likely reason I can think of for them to launch this attack would be as a distraction as they attempt to invade Taiwan. They may think, like Japan before Pearl Harbor, that something like this could knock us out of the war before it begins at all, but all it would do is magnify the force and violence of our response. In the long term, it could destroy the fabric of both our societies, and a few years after a cyber attack, all the countries involved could devolve into warring smaller states. But in the short term, whoever does something like this would suffer brutal consequences. Essentially, I consider cyber warfare the use of weapons of mass destruction worse than nuclear weapons. Not only would it kill more people than the nukes, it would do so in no less horrible ways, and the effects would be far longer lasting. And like with nuclear weapons, this also carries mutually assured destruction. The problem is that the stigma placed on nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons does not extend to cyber warfare, as China and Russia have already made probing attacks, presumably to see if their systems work. So we can only hope that they realize that any real attack would cause most dire of consequences. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.